Hello and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at the Women's University Club in Seattle is writer Thomas Swick, whose new book is The Joys of Travel and Stories That Illuminate Them. Tom, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Nancy.
So would you talk about, you majored in English at Villanova, and then you have made this life as a travel writer. Where did that come from?
Well, as an English major, I was interested in writing, and I got out of college and I realized I had nothing to write about. I'd spent all my life in school. So I worked for a year, and then I saved money and I went to France to learn French, because I thought if I was going to be a travel writer, I should speak another language. And I spent 7 months in an institute for foreign students in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France, a beautiful town. And just as school was ending, my French was almost there, where I was able to talk to people and enjoy my time there, and I didn't want to come home. So I went to northeastern France, Alsace, and ended up getting a job on a farm. And it was a great experience because the family had a son who was my age that summer. He spoke nothing but French to me. He spoke Alsatian at home with the family. But it gave me, a very good foundation in French, but it also gave me experience, something to write about, a travel story. So I came home from that experience and I had to get a job. So I went looking at newspapers because I thought that was the easiest way to get a byline. And there was a newspaper in Trenton, New Jersey, my home state, New Jersey, Trenton Times. It was owned at the time by the Washington Post. And they wouldn't let me see anybody. They just gave me the formal job application. At this point, I'd filled out a number of those. And I just figured there's no reason to play it straight. So they, what was your last employment? I said, working on a farm. And they said, what were your duties? And I said, picking cherries, baling hay, milking cows. And they said, why did you leave your last employment? And I said, well, I got tired of stepping in cow shit. And they said, can we contact your last employer? And I said, sure, if you speak Alsatian. 2 days later, I got a call from the features editor asking me to come in for an interview. So that's kind of how I got started in journalism, and I did that for a few years, and then on my way back from France I met a Polish woman in London, and she'd come to Trenton and then gone back to Poland, and then I followed her back to Poland. I ended up living there for 2.5 years, teaching English, learning Polish, and it happened again very fortuitously. It was the last 2 years I was there for 80 to 82. So I arrived just after Lech Wałęsa founded the Solidarity movement. I was there for the imposition of martial law in December 13th, 1981. And that was the first time in my life when I said, I have to write about this. This is an experience that I really need to tell. And I always kept a journal since college. And in Poland, it became a diary. Every day there was something. And I came home from that, and eventually that became my first book about my time in Poland. So that's kind of how I started as a travel writer.
And then you became the travel editor. And what was that like about? I mean, what was your measure of what would make an interesting story?
Well, I always wanted to be a travel writer.
Right.
So when I got this job as the travel editor of the newspaper, I was delighted. Also, though, I wasn't that crazy about newspaper travel sections. I thought they were really dull, and I thought the travel writers kind of missed the story. Everybody was writing about the same places. Everybody was always going to the same places and kind of writing the same things, about the sites and everything. And I thought it was much more interesting to go often to places that don't get written about very often, and to meet the people and talk and kind of try to find out what it's like, not just for tourists to be there, but what it's like for the people who live there. and kind of see the place not just through the travel writer's eyes, but the eyes of the locals, the natives. And that's what I think makes for a really good travel story, when the travel writer gets beneath the surface. I always thought that my job was to, in a way, have an experience that the average tourist doesn't have. And ideally, that would be getting invited into somebody's home and seeing how they live, you know, or doing something with at least one person in the place, and being able to write about it from that perspective as well.
So who among the other travel writers, who do you most admire, past or present?
Okay, well, at the top of my list is an English, well, most of them are English. The Brits have that wonderful tradition of travel writing. And you know, in the old days, it wasn't just travel writers, it was novelists who wrote travel books. It was part of the job, you know? Aldous Huxley, D.H. Lawrence, Graham Greene.
And you talk in the book, The Joys of Travel, about Graham Greene, how like in one way or another, like wherever you went, Graham Greene had written a novel about that
there
place.
There was that 1 year.
Yeah,
it was like every place I was going, Mexico, Cuba, Vietnam. Haiti. Travel was great for novelists because it got them out of the house, you know, out of their heads. And gave them material. So I love Patrick Leigh Fermor. Patrick Leigh Fermor is this phenomenal case. He, at the age of 19, he dropped out of school in England, took the ferry to Holland, and walked from Holland to Istanbul, which he insisted on calling it Constantinople. And
he was that kind of man.
He was. And his idea at the beginning was to travel, go like a kind of wandering vagabond, a scholarly vagabond, you know, sleeping in barns and picking up whatever information he could. He ended up early on in the trip in Germany meeting an aristocratic family that gave him letters of introduction along his route. So one night he'd sleep in the barn, and the next night he'd sleep in a castle. And the people loved him because he was this charming, very curious. I mean, he would hole up in their library sometimes for weeks at a time and just reading up on the history of the place and the culture and the religion and the flora and fauna, everything. And he wrote about it years later. And his prose is this very kind of ornate, almost Baroque style of writing that I think is very apropos to the subject and the time. He did this in the 30s, just before that world was about to disappear in World War II. So Patrick Leigh Fermor is definitely my favorite of the no longer living travel writers. The writer I love the best now of the living writers is also British, Colin Thubrand, who's incredibly dedicated. He learned Russian before writing his Russian book. He learned Mandarin before writing about China. And he has the intellect that allows him to analyze and interpret places, but he also has the empathy that allows him to connect with people, and that combination is really unbeatable.
Well, Patrick Leigh Fermor was a good friend of Nancy Mitford's.
Yes.
And there's a whole new collection of their letters.
Yes, I know.
Which are really interesting.
I don't have that yet. I have the collection of just his letters. Yeah, but he was a remarkable, very funny and very erudite and just interested in everything. And the one that you would suggest starting with is Time of Gifts. Is that the first one? Yes, that's the first volume. Yeah. I think that's probably the best. The second one is also extremely good. It's called Between the Woods and the Water. And the third one he never finished. And Colin Thubrand and some other people cobbled together his journals and came out with, it's called The Broken Road, which is the last volume of that. Do you regret the fact that that people aren't journaling, they're not keeping that kind of travel journal that the Brits did so much of? And I mean, I know that there's a book about World War I that's so heavily based on the journals of the RAF flyers. Yeah, I haven't thought of that much because I think people are recording their journeys in other ways now, and it may not be the written word, but they may be recording more than they did in the past, just because it's so easy now with photos and Instagram and all the social media. Yeah. I think people are maybe recording their journals more than they used to. But I do regret the fact that we're not going to have collected letters the way we used to.
Right.
Who wants to read anybody's collected emails?
Yeah, right. And it does seem to me in a way that it's less, that all that social media is more immediate but less personal.
Yes.
Than a journal
That's
is.
true. It's very immediate, but
right.
Will it last? I don't know. Yeah.
One of the things that many things that I enjoyed about your book, The Joys of Travel, but one of the things that I loved was how you talk about how German is the language of travel. So could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the word I refer to first in the book is a word, Reisefieber, which we don't have in English, but it describes that feeling of anticipation plus a little bit of anxiety before you leave on a trip. And I think everybody knows that
yeah,
feeling.
Right.
And like a number of German words, they have this way of describing sensations that other languages don't have words for. But they have other words. Wanderlust is one we use in English.
Right.
Before the Brits ever came up with the gap year, the Germans had the Wanderjahr.
Yeah.
They even have a word in German for kind of the opposite of homesickness. It's Fernweh, and it means that feeling of being home and wanting to be elsewhere. And I think it's wonderful that the Germans, and they are really, I think they are the world's greatest travelers. Paul Theroux, there's this constant debate in the travel community about what differentiates a traveler from a tourist, And Paul Theroux has said, a traveler doesn't know where he's going, a tourist doesn't know where he's been. But I also think a true traveler is somebody who goes somewhere and doesn't find the German. Because everywhere I've gone, and I was on an assignment in the Cook Islands once, in this little island of Aitutaki, and I met a German family, professor, his wife, his 2 grown daughters, on vacation, and I asked him about it. Why are the Germans such avid travelers? And he mentioned Goethe, and said that Goethe's book in the late 1700s, Italian Journey, kind of opened Germans' eyes to the seeing what lies beyond their own borders. And I thought that was interesting, and I couldn't help but think, too bad Mark Twain's The Innocents Abroad didn't have the same effect on Americans.
Right. I read somewhere that whenever young travel writers were sort of setting off, or travelers, I don't know, were setting off especially to the Middle East region and the deserts and Arabia Desert, all that sort of thing, they always went to pay their respects to Wilfred Thesiger.
Oh, yeah.
Is he somebody that you wanted to?
No, because he's an explorer and an adventurer.
Yeah.
I'm not an adventurer. I think of myself as very much an urban traveler.
But you do so much traveling alone, which seems adventure. Maybe, I mean, that's one of the things that I was struck by, that you...
Most travel writers do.
Yeah, right.
I was at a conference in Key West, the Key West Literary Seminar. I was on travel writing one year, and there was this very distinguished panel, and they all said, they all travel alone. Jan Morris was the last to comment, and she said, yes, sad but true. There's a saying that travel is the saddest pleasure.
Yes.
And, that may have been coined by one of those people who goes out alone.
But it's also, there's a wonderful, actually, memoir by one of the oldest Peace Corps volunteer called The Saddest Pleasure, which is a wonderful book. Actually, he's an old Seattle family. He comes from an old Seattle family. Yeah, but that's a wonderful book as well.
Yeah, but it's true I travel alone. But again, I'm usually in urban areas. Obviously, urban areas have some iffy, shady sections, neighborhoods too, and I sometimes explore them, but I kind of know my limits. I've never really been in a dangerous situation. The closest is one I write about in the book. I was in Sicily, in Palermo, writing about. I spent a week with this group that's fighting back against the mafia. The group's called Addio Pizzo. Pizzo is what you pay. It's like the protection
Like
of
the
the bride.
bribe.
And addio is goodbye. You know, they're saying goodbye to the pizzo. And there was a restaurateur in Palermo who not only refuses to pay the pizzo, he went to court and identified his extortionist. And I finally met him one of my last days in the city. And we had lunch at his restaurant outside in the terrace. And he was telling about his life, which sounded awful. He had bodyguards, 4 bodyguards, 24 hours a day. And he has a daughter living somewhere in Italy, but he wouldn't tell me where. He said when he goes to visit her, he has to make reservations in 3 or 4 different towns just to throw anybody off. Anyway, we're sitting there, a beautiful August afternoon, having lunch, and he's telling me these stories. A mafioso walks by as we were having lunch. And immediately, as soon as he passed our table, and he passed within, you could reach over and touch him, Vincenzo got on his cell phone, and you could see bodyguards around the square kind of jump into action.
Wow.
And I felt a little uneasy then. You know, I kept seeing those scenes from gangster movies.
Right.
You know, they were, so yeah, that was a little dicey.
Will you talk about the Hotel Atlanta, which
I
I
love
think
to
was
talk
my
about the
favorite
Hotel Atlanta.
chapter in the book?
Yeah, I was going to. For years, I didn't go to Thailand. I went to countries around Thailand, Malaysia and Vietnam, and I just, because I travel alone, I always thought there was something a little suspect about a male going alone to Thailand. Yeah, and so I finally decided to go, and I emailed a friend who'd spent time teaching in Thailand, and he mentioned this hotel. I should maybe stay in Bangkok. And I looked up on their website, and they won me over immediately. One of their slogans was, "The Atlanta is untouched by pop culture and postmodern vulgarity." And I wrote to them. I got a room there. Well, the thing is, the story of the hotel was founded in 1952 by a German who had been a chemist, and he married a Thai. And they turned their laboratory basically into the hotel. They had the first hotel swimming pool in Thailand in this hotel. It has an Art Deco lobby that's barely been touched since 1952. And the son now runs it, who is obviously half German, half Thai.
Dr. Hen.
Dr. Charles Hen, and he's an academic. He taught political science in England for many years. He was educated in England. And he's not a hotelier by profession or by inclination. He just keeps it alive in memory of his parents, or his father, because his mother, when I was there, was still alive. And it's right near one of these neighborhoods in Bangkok with, you know, bar girls and the sex trade and everything. And he is totally against that. And everywhere you go in the hotel, there are signs saying, "Sex tourists not welcome."
Right.
And my first night going up the steps, I arrived at Bangkok at around midnight, and I got into the hotel, and I'm groggy, and I'm walking up, and there's this big sign with all these rules, and one was, again, you're not allowed to bring in prostitutes or catamites.
Yes, right. And then you talked about the Anthony Burgess book.
Yeah. I mean, where do you see that word these days? So I just love the place. It had the feel a little bit of even though I don't even know what a British boarding school is like, but I sensed it was maybe like a British boarding school. In the dining room, they have the Times Literary Supplement on wooden sticks.
Like old libraries.
Yeah, and he plays classical music in the dining room and jazz at certain hours, because the King of Thailand was a great jazz fan. And when I stayed there, it was $26 a night. It's gone up, I think maybe it's around $40 now. But it's a great place to stay. A lot of families stay there, a lot of single women travelers. They feel very safe there. And it's a hotel, you know, not just with a personality, but with a morality. I mean, it's just so
I know you describe,
unusual.
yeah, you describe all the signs and how you wanted to copy down the menu because there's all of these comments on everything. And
There's sayings from famous people about
Right.
food. And I started writing it down the first morning. The waitress came over and admonished me because no copies are supposed to be made of the menu. And I had this, so you had this, the whole time I was there, I had this vision of Dr. Charles Henn, who keeps a very low profile. You never see him at the hotel. And to me, he was almost like the Wizard of Oz, this guy behind the curtain making this magical thing happen. And I finally met him. My last day, I requested an interview, and he came out, and he was much more sympathetic than I expected him to be. And we've actually become friends now, and he's just actually a wonderful man.
do you sometimes, when you discover a place like that, do you sometimes regret that you write about it because it's not going to be the same?
It's funny you mentioned that because I just wrote a piece about, my wife and I went to Portugal last year, and Portugal is one of my favorite countries. I love it. I went there for the first time in '89, and we stayed in Lisbon, and Lisbon's now been discovered. It's a darling of tourists now, and I think part of it is that they see it as safe. You know, there haven't been any terrorist attacks or anything, so you know, the people used to go more to Northern European cities now are going down to Portugal. And it changed for me, you know, seeing all these tourists. And I realized, well, I'm partly responsible. I'm a travel writer. And
Right.
me and I and my ilk have made this happen. Most of the places, though, that I write about, as I said, are unsung. A lot of the places are unsung. In the book, there's a story about Iowa. There's a story about Warsaw. I've written about Mobile, Alabama, Columbus, Ohio. Nobody's beating a path to these cities today. But the Atlanta, I don't know. It's not happened. I mean, again, I think writers sometimes over-exaggerate their influence.
Yeah.
And you know, at that time, I just wrote it for my newspaper, South Florida Sun-Sentinel, which not that many people knew about or read. So no, he hasn't been inundated with tourists.
Because I have to tell you, when I finished that chapter, it was all I could do. And my husband does not like to travel, so I mean, but that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to Bangkok, and I wanted to stay at that hotel.
I think you would get along very well with Dr. Swick, too. He's a great
He's a reader.
He's a reader. Well, he's got a library.
Right.
He's got a library in the hotel, in the lobby, and he loves when guests are authors. So he asks them to send them the books. In fact, I have to send them the new paperback, and he wants you to write the dedication in magic marker on the cover, and he'll put it up in the glass bookcase. Yeah.
So, what was your what was a trip that you regretted doing? You know, or what was a place? Or is it like when people like, I don't talk about books I didn't like, because I think there's so many books that are wonderful to read. So I don't talk about books that I don't think people should read.
Right.
Does that translate to the travel?
I think it can, but just that, you know, if you're on assignment or you go far, you do feel like you should come back with a story.
Yeah.
Anyway. And there is a saying in travel writing that the worst trips make the best stories.
Yeah.
That if something goes really wrong, calamitously wrong, well, at least you have something to write about now. And I think we all experience that when you have when you're traveling, these things happen. You say, "We'll laugh about this someday."
Right.
But there are the trips that nothing really happens at all, and I had that in Myanmar a few years ago. Though I did take the worst train trip I've ever taken, and that is a chapter in the book,
Yes, it is.
The Joys of Travel. The joy was when the trip was over. But it was like being on a roller coaster for 19 hours because the train just, I thought we were going to derail almost the entire time. But generally, my stay in Myanmar, I thought it was going to be, I went to Vietnam in '94 where I had one of my best trips ever. I'd be sitting by myself and students would come up and say, "Are you American?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And they said, "Can we practice our English?" And they just want to talk, and that, when you're a travel writer, it's exactly what you want. That didn't happen in Myanmar. I think because, you know, they still weren't used to talking to foreigners. It wasn't part of their culture. It was just one of those trips where it just didn't click. And that happens sometimes, you know. So the only thing I wrote was about that, the train trip. I didn't write anything else about my time.
Do you think there's a whole new generation of travel writers who we can expect to hear from, or not?
Not like there was. You know, there was in the 80s. 80s was the last time travel writing was very, very popular. You know, Paul Theroux came out with The Great Railway Bazaar. Bruce Chatwin came out with In Patagonia, which people in so-called more serious genres said was a piece of literature. And then you had this whole wave, you know, Colin Thuban, Bill Bryson, just a lot of travel writers came out then. I don't see that happening now. In fact, Granta magazine, which was at the forefront of the travel writing in the 80s, had an issue last year, is travel writing dead?
Oh,
And they asked a number of travel writers who all said no.
Yeah, right.
But they did, a lot of them admitted it's changed. And what you're getting now, you know, it used to be Graham Greene would go to these countries and tell us about them. Now, the residents of those countries are telling us about them, either in English or in translation, you know. So it's there's a different process at work, I think.
So when you listed those travel writers, Bill Bryson and Colin Thuban, and there's no women.
No, there definitely are. I mean, Freya Stark, I think, is a great travel writer. I think, and I think it's so sad that she's almost completely forgotten, Kate Simon.
Oh, she's wonderful. Her book about New York.
Anything she writes.
Yeah, the New York one I thought was fabulous.
She wrote these guides in the 70s called Uncommon Guidebooks. Did it Mexico, Paris, London, Rome. And what they were guidebooks with the, you know, lists of restaurants and hotels, but also there'd be lyrical essays on aspects of the country, the culture. So any traveler going there had everything in one book, you know, the practical information, and then when you just wanted to sit down and read for pleasure, it was there as well. And she wrote these wonderful memoirs too, A Wider World, about her coming of age, grew up in Brooklyn, and then ended up being a travel writer. And I love her. I think she's one of the best American travel, or any. And I think
those books are out of print.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. They are. But you can find them in used bookstores.
Right.
But there are, you know, and I think there are more and more female travel writers. They're definitely around.
Well, our time, unfortunately, is up, and it just flew by.
It did.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
I loved the book. And
Thanks.
if I go I have your email, so if I go to the Atlanta in Bangkok.
Put you in touch.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Thomas Swick.
Thanks, Nancy.